Then from the driveway north toward, ultimately toward the town's walking trail that goes in behind Fox Run, that section is where they're proposing the sidewalk. And the reason I'm bringing this up, they're requesting, and this is the section out in the field, that's the driveway, the Miss Lindsay driveway. So the sidewalk section that I highlighted earlier extends, several feet to the north of that. What they're requesting is a variance from the subdivision regulations for the grass strip width. On a collector street, you are typically required a 6-foot wide grass strip there. They're requesting a 3-foot wide grass strip with curb and gutter along that section. And Daryl and I, the town engineer, we've looked at this. We've met with Gary out there. They've got some real topographic problems with getting a 6-foot wide grass strip and putting in, in like an 8-foot wide asphalt trail. That's why they're going with something more narrow with the sidewalk. There's a ditch there. There's a small shelf off of Everett Road, but then there's kind of a ditch, and then there's a steep bank that goes, that, 20, 30 feet high. So we think that given, the small length involved and the topographic situation that they're facing here, that their request for that particular variance is justified for topographic reasons. It's kind of a little bit hard to see this at this time of year because of the vegetation, but they've got some. To put in a trail with the 6-foot wide walking trail, you'd be doing some significant grading and probably retaining walls, very tall retaining walls. So this would seem like a reasonable variance request. That's one item that needs to be voted on separately. Then we need to vote on the preliminary plat itself.
How far is this little piece of sidewalk going to go? It's not going to connect to the Farragut Trail, is it?
No, it just goes along what would be their frontage.
It's about 100 feet from that driveway.
Yeah.
And then,
Yeah.
I may be wrong on this, but I'd rather state it. It almost seems foolish to me to put anything there. I mean, I know that road, it's narrow. I don't really want anybody walking along that road. Eventually, the only way that road's really ever going to be safe to have people walking on it is when we widen that road, just like we plan to do up to the entrance to your development that we're discussing tonight. I'm all for the trails, I'm all for the sidewalks, but I think there's times we need to say, you know what, is this really the right place for one? Because what's going to happen eventually, we're going to rip that thing out because we're going to redo that road. Now, that's many years down the road, there's nothing to argue about. But there's also many years down the road we're going to have a sidewalk that just ends and doesn't connect to anything. So I don't know if it's even an option for us to say, well, let's just leave that piece of sidewalk out. But it's going to be a stub for many years.
It's a relatively short distance from where they would terminate this sidewalk to that walking trail. It goes behind Fox Run.
It's probably another 100 feet, maybe.
It's a little more than that.
Okay.
Yeah, it would be
300 or 400 feet total.
But that's just a dangerous. I mean, that is not a road I'd recommend anybody walking along.
But do they?
Do they? No, I've never seen anybody walk on it, not once. And I drive that road probably as much, if not more, than anybody. Do you see anybody ever walk on
I never
it?
see anyone.
Yeah.
I have, when I drive it, I think, could I run this? I could run here, I could run here, I can't run here, I can't run here. So it's not safe. I would agree with your reservations.
We would be glad to stub it out to this side of the driveway and end our trail with the 8-foot wide asphalt trail at that driveway. To me, I've thought that made more sense all along.
Now, you said that needed to be a separate item anyway, so first we need to tackle number 4 here. Did you have any other, of the other 13 items, we've had a lot of discussion on most of them already. The rest of them look like they're just little clarity items. Did you have any other concerns with that?
No, I don't see any of them that we can't address.
Okay. I would like to make a motion for approval
Now, do
with
we
the
need
same changes as before.
Do we need to do the variance first, Mark?
No.
Okay. So we have a motion. Second.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? And
Ron, did your motion just include just eliminating that section that is basically west of that gravel driveway?
Yeah, I guess my intent was to
But that's
change
the variance.
change the
That's the
wording of the
variance.
variance. Maybe I
Okay.
misunderstood.
Yeah,
If
that's
I
the
have to go back and,
yeah, no, that's the variance, which we need to
Okay.
do separately.
We need to do a motion on that variance.
Yeah.
Actually, there's kind of two variances, isn't there? We have that one.
The sinkhole one was approved through the Board of Zoning Appeals.
Okay.
That's a separate ordinance and a separate review.
The only
Uh,
sidewalk variance we have is that.
Since this is in the subdivision regulations, then you all are the ones that would need
Okay.
to act
Okay.
on a variance.
so what I would like to, hopefully I'll word this properly. I think I've explained my intent. Mark, tell me if I'm missing the mark on the wording. I would like to make a motion to approve a variance to cause the sidewalk to just end at this driveway and not extend to the north past that driveway. That's my intent.
Would be the walking trail end there, and so therefore they wouldn't even have a concrete sidewalk.
The sidewalk start on the north side.
Yes.
Right, okay, thank you for that clarity. So to have the walking trail end at this driveway with no sidewalk north of that particular driveway.
Same thing with the curb and gutter, just 86 the curb and gutter and the sidewalk.
Yes. Yep. So if you can polish up that
Basically, you're
motion.
requesting a variance for no pedestrian facility north of the driveway.
There you go.
Yeah.
Yes, that would be my motion, thank you.
I'll second that motion.
Are you on this issue or?
Not on this issue,
Okay,
not on this
okay.
particular.
So,
So we have a motion and a second.
motion,
Oh,
and a second.
Mhm.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed?
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Move on to item number 5, discussion and public hearing on a request to amend
Sorry, is there not an opportunity for the public to do?
There is, and we accidentally omitted that as far as having the public, and you're probably maybe prior to the previous motion, to have some public input on that. Is that right?
Right.
Chairman?
Well, we asked for anybody having any comments, and they got up, and nobody else did, so we're sorry.
Ma'am, I'm sorry, I didn't hear anybody say, stand up if we had any comments. That's if I missed my opportunity.
And we have already voted on that issue, but if you'd like to make a comment, we'd be glad to hear.
We can hear.
My name is David Metz, and I live at 12604 Comblane Road in Fox Run, which is obviously the adjacent development. By way of perspective, the bottom blue line that you took out comes right behind my property, so it just gives you a sense of where I am. I also happen to be the scoutmaster for Troop 444, so I just want to acknowledge that there are 5 members of my troop here this evening. I'm very proud of them for showing up and participating. I'd like to express my concern about the additional quantity of lots that are being, in my opinion, shoehorned into the southern part of this particular development. I appreciate the developer's desire to find a marketing approach, and I understand that completely. But I'm a little concerned that I believe there are 13 additional lots being put in here. Apparently 9 of them are in that one section off of the first roundabout and the southern spur into that circle. I'm sorry, I don't know the name of the road. But they are all adjacent to the property line for Fox Run. And I wanted to express my concern about that and also my dissatisfaction with that, and wondered if there wasn't an opportunity perhaps to spread that, those additional lots out a little bit more around the rest of the property, so that you don't have very large lots every other part of the development and very small lots on one side in particular.
Mark, can you explain the, how that's determined
Well,
based on the regulations?
In the OSR, the density, the overall number of lots is determined by the gross acreage. So they got roughly 50 acres. You divide that by the density permitted in the base zoning district, which is rural residential. That's a 20,000 square foot lot, and that gives you a raw number of of lots that you could have in a development. The OSR allows a lot more flexibility in how lots are configured, distances between buildings. There's lots of things in there that are incentives. In exchange for that, however, the applicant is required to provide at least 35% of the overall development as permanent open space. So one good thing for Fox Run, in my opinion at least, is that there is a whole lot of open space in this development, whereas if it were more traditional residential development, you'd have only potentially, at least 10% open space. As far as
and in that case, more lots, is that right?
Well, the total number of lots would still be the same. It's just the way they're arranged, based on the base zoning district. So really, what this latest lot layout is really just something that the applicant has proposed. It looks like, for the most part, the lots on the north end, as you mentioned, are still, larger, kind of like what was in the previous approved split rail concept and preliminary plat. And in the southern end, which is my understanding, they're going to plat that as a second phase of split rail. Their intentions, as far as I understand it, are to submit a final plat when they're ready, when the site is ready out there, for the lots that are on the north end, the larger lots first. And they may want to see how those sell, how the marketing goes for those, and they may come back and revisit the lot layouts for the lots on the south end. I don't know. That's not something that I would get involved with. I can tell you that, as I mentioned earlier, when this was Carastone Farms, back in 2012, they showed actually 105 lots. So
I would have been here talking about that then.
Yeah,
too.
they've scaled it down quite a bit to 73.
Sure.
So, yeah.
And that's a wonderful thing. And again, I understand and appreciate what the developer's attempting to do. I just wonder if there's not some minimal requirements. It's hard for me to tell. I don't have great eyesight, and the drawings aren't terrific, at least the copies that I have, as to the size of the lots, again, kind of on that southwest curve, square footage-wise. Are those quarter acre? Are they third acre? Are they half acre?
Gary, do you remember? About 11, 12,000.
So comparatively speaking, and by the way, you eliminated the trail that what is lot number 12, which makes that lot significantly larger. I would say that one looks like it's about 3 times as large as some of the smaller ones. But again, comparatively speaking, I'm just wondering with the kind of houses that we're going to see on those lots compared to what we might see on a half acre or 3/4 acre lot.
Something you might want to keep in mind, I've had some experience with both R1, traditional R1 developments as well as R1 OSR. Something that this particular developer has to do that is not even required in your neighborhood is your neighborhood, and a matter of fact, I've lived in Fox Run and have a tremendous amount of respect for the neighborhood and love the association and all my neighbors. But the rear setback in an R1 neighborhood is only 25 feet.
Right.
So you can actually build within 25 feet.
Right.
This developer actually, due to the fact that it's OSR, he actually can't get any closer than 50 feet
50.
from that rear
Yeah.
property line.
Which
And so that actually
right.
buys you another
Sure.
25 feet of
Yeah.
buffer. Well, I mean, I won't necessarily call it buffer, but it's, open space, if you will. And so that is something, personally, if it was behind me, I'd rather have that house further back from my property line, even though it may be on a smaller lot. We really can't dictate the size or the quality of houses that they build, but I suspect being the location that they're in and what they're probably having to pay per lot of what it costs to do that neighborhood, it'd be hard for me to think that they're going to put anything in there for less than $400,000 or $500,000. It's just how the market is, and by the time you're sitting on a $60,000 or $70,000 or $80,000 lot, it's kind of what it ends up being.
And I appreciate that, and I think there's something wonderful about that setback. That's great, but it also, again, reduces the size of buildable space on that lot, which to me,
It does.
I express that as a concern of what the size of the house is going to be, and how close is it going to be to the house, that's next to it. Are we going to have, reach out and talk to your neighbor and, touch your neighbor type of houses, or are we going to have houses that are a little bit further?
Well, houses are required to be at least 20 feet apart. So,
Whereas you're in Fox Run, you probably have a combination of a 40-foot setback, so you can go 25 on one side
Right.
and 15 on the other.
Right.
So, there's no doubt that those houses are potentially going to be closer together than what you experience right now in Fox Run, but they're also not going to be eligible to build as close to that rear property line as what you could build in Fox Run.
I
The lots
appreciate-
are larger in the north because it's more slope up there, and I think that's a good design. Typically, you want to make the lots larger if you have topographic challenges. And then where it's more flat, I think they probably try to work in some smaller lots. So,
And could you maybe explain to them the OSR is because of topographical, can't say that tonight, topographical issues?
yeah, the open space residential zoning district is an overlay. That means there's a base zoning district, which is R1 for this property, just same as part of Fox Run
Sure.
is R1. But then there's an overlay over that where there's additional requirements that relate to that development, but there's also some things that they can do that wouldn't be allowed in a standard R1. And the open space residential is really intended for properties that have some, environmental opportunities, some things like sinkholes, maybe some steep slopes or drainage areas that we're trying to protect. And it allows people to, developer to use those areas toward how they determine the total number of lots, so they get some benefit out of that, what would become open space. But, it ends up being at least 35% open space. Bridgemore is an open space residential development. Sheffield, cottages at Price Farm, there's several in the town. So
Well, I appreciate the tutorial. Again, I'll just leave with my concerns about how tight those lots are going to be comparatively speaking. And I appreciate the time this evening. Thank you.
Yeah, and give us your name and address, please.
Very good. I'm Kevin Riley. I live at 12600 Comblaine Road in the Fox Run subdivision. And my comments will be very brief because my neighbor and colleague here spoke very well about the concerns, but I would also second that concern of those 4 or 5 lots right there. My lot backs up directly behind those additional smaller lots that have been added in there. And I think that's just a little unreasonable considering the standards behind us in Fox Run, the property sizes that are bordering that community there. So anyway, I just want to throw that out there, that I think that's significantly narrow and a significant different standard than what's existing there in the Fox Run adjacent neighborhood. Thank you.
Anybody else have any comments? Then we'll move on to item number 5, discussion and public hearing on a request to amend section 9-4064P of the Farragut sign ordinance related to wall signs for shared entrance buildings in the O-1-3 and O-1-5 zoning district. IMS Incorporated, INC applicant.
okay, this item has been discussed at 2 previous planning commission meetings. This particular request involves the 2 office buildings and professional building out on Parkside Drive right before you leave the town, the 5-story and the 3-story building. At the last meeting, there was a lot of discussion about the requested amendment, and the staff was asked to prepare an ordinance that would basically on this, provide for at least 4 walls, up to 4 wall signs, where the cumulative total of sign area for all 4 of the signs together would be based on the width of the building that faces the public street. So in the case of this building, I think it's 288 feet of frontage facing Parkside Drive. They would have 288 square feet of wall signage that could be divided up among the 4 different entities. That way, you're not providing them more square footage than any other, comparable development in the town. Again, the buildings to qualify here have to be at least 225 feet wide. That's been a requirement. And the signs have to be 50 feet apart. So that was one of the stipulations. The other was for the signage that is requested on the sides of the building, which is really what the applicant has been wanting, that those be centered on the building elevation, on each side building elevation, that there be a maximum of 2 colors that would be permitted, and that the signs collectively would have a proportionality and scale to them, so that if you looked at the building holistically, no one sign looks like it's out of place in relation to the other 3 signs, that they all kind of have a consistency to them. So the wording proposed in ordinance 14-07, which is basically the top wording there, the changes are in red, is what the staff had put together. Resolution PC-14-04 recommends approval of this ordinance to amend section 9-406 4P of the Farragut sign ordinance. As I've said all along, the staff doesn't support the ordinance, but I think the cleanest approach is to name the building similar to the medical office building. But again, the ordinance before you is what we have prepared, and I think the applicant's here if you have any questions.
Let me ask you a question first. In this last paragraph, with other signs in the complex, what are you talking about? Define a complex.
Let's see, which one are you talking about?
That last paragraph.
The
Right.
last
Such wall
paragraph
signs.
and
Yeah, come
Right
on.
in front of the last red wording.
Is it new wording?
No, it's
No,
right
no,
before
it's
the new
Oh.
word.
Existing
Right
word
before.
and illumination with the other signs.
The complex would be the development, the building.
just that one building, not
Yeah.
any other buildings around it.
No,
Oh, okay.
no, it'd be that one building, whether it's the 5-story building or the 3-story
Oh,
building.
okay.
Yep.
I have a question, and I think this is for the applicant. When I passed by that building, I'm not sure, the other day, the Region sign is down. So it just has the one sign up there.
Raymond James on.
Yes, the Raymond James sign is up. Why can't Doraline have the slot where the Regions Bank sign was?
Tell us
Arthur,
first who you are.
yeah, Arthur Seymour, 550 West Main Avenue, Knoxville, Tennessee, 37902. May I defer to the leasing agents on that? Matt, can you, Matt Fentress? I'm just the lawyer, I'm not.
Matt Fentress, 804 Hidden Glen Lane, Knoxville. And then to address that question, the Suncoke, who is a tenant for the top 2 floors, has rights on that, and we're unable to give those rights to anybody else until their lease is up.
When is their lease up?
2017.
Why should we change, make a zoning change to satisfy a bad decision on lease terms?
Well, we're trying to bring businesses to Farragut right now and put them in the building, and we're unable to do that.
I must admit the discussion and presentation about why they needed that corporate sign there was terribly unconvincing to me.
Well, the reason that we need signage rights is because of tenants that want to take a look at that building and would like to go in the building. They may be one-floor tenants, in which you could have 4 different one-floor tenants in the building. And that's about 1/5 of the building each. Now, your bottom floor is divided up into multiple tenant sizes due to the pathways through the building, common areas through the building. So potentially in the future, you'd have 4 tenants of 20,000 square feet that would all want the right to have a sign on the building.
Okay. I want to read from the sign ordinance. Promote the public health, safety, and welfare by prohibiting improperly designed and located signs which would distract, confuse, mislead, or obstruct vision. Now, I think these signs are distraction. If you're driving down the road and you want to look up there, and as the trees grow, you're not going to be able to see over the trees. You can have a ground-mounted sign out front that would list all your tenants, and it would be at eye level in a much safer way. Also, if you are driving east and the name you're looking for is on the east end of the building, you're not going to see that. You're going to drive past it, and vice versa with going west. So it's nothing but a billboard in that sense. Now, you can see that building from across the street, but right there in front of the building you cannot. And if you're in the parking lot yourself, you got to go stand a road in the parking lot. You got to look almost straight up to even see the signs. So I don't see that as helpful. And I think if the Planning Commission sees fit to approve this, it needs to be clearly stated that there can be no more than 4 signs, no matter how many street fronts.
The ordinance
Yeah.
says so.
It does say that.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it does.
Well, one thing I'd like to add on the discussion, we've had this prior.
Please talk into the microphone so
Sure.
they can hear you at home.
I'm sorry. Well, one thing that's very important for tenants moving into a building, this right now is probably as fine a building as there is in Knox County. I mean, it's real Class A space, is it, Matt? It's not a billboard, it's tenant identification. AT&T will not go into a building where they cannot have AT&T up there. Major tenants will simply not go into a building unless they can have their corporate identification associated with that building. And that is what Matt and Polly and Deborah are all up against in getting this building. You heard from Mr. Grimsley at Deerline how important it was for them. This is, and why they wanted their name up there, because they're headquartered in the town of Farragut and want people to be able to see that they're here. It's not that they're advertising a product for sale or something like that. It's simply, we are here. We are want to be identified with this building, which is a very fine building.
Can you not get Sunco, is that what it is, has a lease on that? Get them, are they in the building now? Or can you not get them to release that?
For a price, I suspect.
Large price.
And I would
It's no
contend to
good
you
to
that,
them.
I'm sorry.
So you're saying it can't be on the building at all on that side?
And Sunco's a perfect example. They're in the coal business. You can't go in the building and buy coal. All they had were their offices in there. That was the old Sun Oil Coal Company. And they just see that as part of their corporate branding. It's very important. Hopefully, there'll be some more office buildings, if not on Parkside, across the interstate, because you have the traffic counts. I've been dealing with this uptown on that Langley building. That is very important to a tenant going in there, that they can be seen from the interstate there.
Well, you as an attorney, can you deal with, send them a letter or something and ask if they will release that? You can, huh?
I can send them a letter, they will.
What they're
Base
gonna do
can,
is say releases from the rent obligation on our space. in
So
order to
you
get
all
that
are
up.
renting the space too?
They turn around and sublease.
They'll turn around and sublease to someone, or there'll be some type of buyout arrangement should a tenant come and take both floors.
You know, just a comment I want to make. I want to reground everybody, because even though it was one tenant that was here and who laid his case out very well, convinced me anyways, the issue is not about one sign on this building. I mean, what your request was to allow more than 2 signs on the building. I just want to reground everybody. I mean, even if Suncoke said, okay, we'll let somebody else put their name up, your request was still to have more than that. So I just want to provide that clarity to get us regrounded. The issue was not just that one spot to replace a sign,
Yes, I understand.
but rather to have signs on the other sides of the building.
And the other two things, or the one thing I would emphasize, we're not asking for an increase in the signage on the building, only the ability to allocate the way the signage is done. The square footage will not change under the ordinance, Mr. Shipley.
Yeah. I think there are pros and cons on both sides, but anyway, there's some lessons that we learned for future too. I mean, over the next 2 years, even with this lease running to 2017, we have the potential for other, even though limited areas of the town, we have certainly the opportunity for other buildings of this size to have this problem or this desire for the signage. And I kind of look long-term at that to be a positive, that we want to attract people and have that flexibility. But there's a real lesson learned in that future that says it has to do with leasing. And your problem right now specifically is you're tied it up in knots with that lease and preventing it. Well, we have 4 sides. We could have 3 blank spaces all being held hostage. Or 4 spaces.
Could I speak to that?
This region's moved out and they want to, break their lease away. So there's a lesson to be learned here that we can't deal with as a planning commission. But I guess, if I had to look at the pros and cons, I would like to see some flexibility up there. But I don't know how to address, other than just admonishing the lesson learned that comes out of the leasing part of that equation.
Yeah, not part of our
situation.
not part of our responsibility.
Yeah, I agree, but we'd still be in the position if we were to lease one of the floors and not the other, then we're still trying to fight to get a tenant here when other office buildings
Understand.
in the area cannot offer signage and we can't. So that's why we're asking for that right to have 4.
Well, I guess I've come to the point where I see this, if we make this change, I don't see it damaging our sign ordinance that bad. And in fact, I don't think it'll set a precedent for anything, because we're talking about big buildings, 4 or 5 stories or whatever, and that applies to only a few buildings so far. Whatever has to happen internally with finances or whatever else is not our business. Our business is, should they have 4 signs on the building or 2? And I think I've come to the point where I do see some usefulness for the other 2 signs. And I don't see it as an attraction, because when I ride by it one time and see the sign, then I don't ever have to look at it again, because I know who's there. And so I would move that we adopt this ordinance change.
I'll second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed?
No.
Need to roll call vote?
Please. Yes, please.
Okay. Usually.
Oh, okay, sorry.
It's you, Mark.
That's-
Myers.
Aye.
Dick.
Nay.
Whiting.
Aye.
Okay, McGill.
Was that an aye?
Yes.
Ed.
Yeah.
No.
Aye.
Tollifield.
Aye.
Day. I'm sorry. St. Clair, I was
Aye.
getting you mixed up with Cindy,
Yeah.
sorry.
Nay.
Baldwin.
Nay.
Nay.
Aye.
Okay. So we had two opposed. Okay.
Thank you very much for hearing us. This is the 3rd time we've been here. We appreciate it. Y'all's time and direction.
Item number 6 is for discussion only. Is that right? That tonight it's discussion on an amendment to the
Yes.
text of the Farragut zoning ordinance, Chapter 3, Section 11, multifamily residential district R-6, to replace it with a new requirement. Ross Bradley, TKD Construction, and PMG applicants. I'm gonna spell a dirty word there.
Okay.
It's a lot of acronyms.
Yeah.
Just to give you an overview here, of course, we discussed this at last month's meeting. The applicants, two applicants, essentially wanting to amend the same section of our zoning ordinance. There was a good discussion last month. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to make the meeting, but I did watch the video. There was a number of the things that the applicants were requesting that didn't appear to be an issue, and there wasn't much discussion on it. However, there were a few changes that they're requesting where, in order for the staff to be able to move forward with any kind of potential ordinance amendment language, I think we need some more guidance from you all and more input. Those particular topics were, I narrowed it down to 5, and if there's others, certainly you can bring them up. This is just kind of my assessment of what I saw. That's setbacks, buffer strips, lot coverage, height, and open space. In looking at this, I thought maybe, and again, this is just my opinion, maybe the cleanest way to deal with this is to try to take each of these sections, review again what the applicants are requesting, although there might be some variation there, what the staff's comment was on each item, and then I came up with some questions. Again, there could be more questions than I've listed in the packet, but I think if we can get good answers to the questions that I've included, I think I'll have pretty good direction to do something if you want this section of the zoning ordinance to change. So first, in dealing with the setbacks, currently in R6, we have a 50-foot setback around the periphery of the development. The applicants are requesting to go to 35 feet with an additional setback for each foot the building would be higher than 35 feet. The staff's comment was that if additional setback, if there is some relaxation in the setbacks, that we definitely feel that there should be some building height modifications that relate to the setback. In other words, a greater setback would be a shorter building, and a closer setback would the building would basically have to be set back further if they were wanting to go higher with the building. So some of the questions that I think would be helpful to discuss as it relates to setbacks, and this could also be related to buffer strips because they are really kind of interrelated, would lessening the setback from 50 to 35 feet be something that you all would consider? That's a really big question. I don't know how y'all feel about that. Does anybody have any comment or? And some of the other questions here under setbacks could also relate to that first question. You may want to look at architectural standards if the building is allowed to be closer to the periphery than currently allowed. And again, the setback and height relationship, you may want to, if you relax the setback distance, require shorter buildings along that periphery where that development is adjacent to residential or agriculture properties.
Can I ask a question about if, we're talking about changing the R6 zoning district, not necessarily about an overlay. Can you have the setbacks set in the R6 zoning district and relax them in the overlay? Is that something you would do?
Well, it kind of gets
or
to one of the questions under the open space topic, and that is whether this multifamily question should be addressed with maybe a more standard amendment to the R6 and then have a separate kind of overlay for multifamily that
But
would...
is that an option to say, okay, these are our setbacks in the R6, but if you have if it's an overlay?
It could be. It could be something that you would provide as an incentive for a developer, because that developer is going to be providing a lot more open space, just similar to the split rail farm subdivision. They get some flexibility in their lot layout and placement of buildings and things, but they have to provide at least 35% open space. So yeah, I think that you could be looking at different setbacks for the two.
Maybe this evolves into an R6 OSR.
Yeah.
You know,
And we've talked about that, you know, at past planning commission meetings, that it may be something that, yeah, similar to an OSR except applied to multifamily.
Let me ask this, what is it that's driving this request? Is it you don't have a big enough piece of property, or what?
I think for us, and I don't want to speak for the other developer, but I think for us, the restrictions as they are today restricts location. They just really make it challenging to develop multifamily in the town of Farragut. And so that is that's our biggest struggle. You know, the setbacks. And
So is it density that's
I wouldn't say it's one issue because there's several different points that were kind of broken down there. I think it's just an overall. What we tried to do was to be objective with the recommendations that we have, because there's certain things that, for example, building height, that we proposed 50-foot building height. That didn't directly impact our project because we're going with 2-story buildings, and so we didn't feel like it would be appropriate to make suggestions that only applied to our project for the overall R6 ordinance. We thought, in talking with Mark, we tried to give recommendations based on our experience in the other municipalities that we worked in, and then Mark has kind of taken those recommendations and said, well, what really worked well in our community. And so I think that's kind of what we've been working with these recommendations, because I think as it sits today, it's very restrictive on what is able to be done in R6, and so I think working with Mark, we've tried to come up with a solution that works both for a potential developer to come in and develop in the town of Farragut, but also still stick with the same guidelines that have been seen on other developments in the town of Farragut. So, does that answer your question?
I think so.
One thing, Mark, I might add. One thing that we discussed a lot was setbacks for the buildings, but we talked about how that relates to building height, and we talked about 35-foot setbacks, and then we proposed 25-foot for the buffer. And I know one of your concerns, Mark, was that the buffers, you didn't want 4-story buildings next to residential because of the height. What if we applied the same thought process with the buffers that we apply with the building setbacks? That if a building over 35 foot it has to be set back, let's say it's a 40-foot building, not only does that building set back additional 5 feet, but the buffer sits back an additional 5 feet. Would that be better for you from the standpoint that you're trying to protect those residential lots for taller buildings?
Well, that might be one way to deal with it, is to look at that. I think, like in the land use plan, one of the big concepts was transitions, and that was as a protection for existing neighborhoods. And one of the concepts with, as you know, with transitions, you do this in all the projects that I've seen you do. Typically on the perimeter, the area that abuts maybe other residential that's not in character with the multifamily, less density residential, you may have 2-story buildings, and as you go into the core of the multifamily development, you may transition to 3- and 4-story buildings. So you have a transition, you know, visual and use kind of transition between adjacent residential developments that are, you know, kind of different in appearance and function. So, you know, however you go about doing that, I think, is not an unreasonable application.
I don't know that homeowners are going to be pleased to have a 2- or 4-story building in their backyard, period, but especially with it being closer.
One thing that we did, and I don't know if you've noticed the red tape on the floor, but
Good.
I don't know if anybody can see that or not. But this is a starting line point, and then just trying to give you an indication of
Farragut has red tape.
David is at a 35-foot setback right here. That's 35 feet. The intermediate red mark is 25 feet.
All right, go back 50 feet.
From wall. Can't do that. Basically, from that wall to that wall is 52 feet. So 50 feet is essentially the depth of this building.
This room.
Why didn't you consider, if you're really concerned about having a large, tall building right up next to a standard residential area, why not set up a site angle with requirement that for this angle from the top of the 2-story building, you know, whatever.
Like a
whatever
sight
top,
line, like you see on
sight line, and then
HVAC screening and
it's
stuff.
going to be higher. This sight line's got to remain the same.
Yeah, wow, yeah.
Be topographically driven, kind of.
Hmm?
It'd be kind of more driven by the topography.
That's what you were trying to say.
Could be.
Could be.
I think the real challenge with that, as much as I like Ed's idea, is trying to put together a conceptual plan for a developer without having to go out there and do a full-blown topo field survey. And so, to me, as much as I like when we come up with these formulas, we're pretty good at coming up with formulas, and I think we need to make it something relatively easy that a developer, a prospective developer, can evaluate a site for its merits and its constraints, and without spending a lot of money, you know, a few $1,000s maybe, they can sit down with a civil engineer and do a conceptual plan and sit down with staff and say, okay, based on our R6 or R6 OSR, these are the things that we can do, and they're real easy to understand. Maybe even for somebody that's not a civil engineer, you can go through and say, okay, if your building's, I haven't really bought into dropping it to 35 feet, but let's say we did, and if your building's 35 feet, then you could have a 35-foot setback. If your building's 45 feet, you gotta have a 45-foot setback. If you're 50 feet, you gotta have a 50-foot setback. So I think that generally addresses what Ed's talking about. The taller the building, the further the back it has, further away from the property line it has to be. But, and it makes it, I think, a lot easier to put together a concept plan, kind of like what you see on the screen there, to say, okay, this is what we can and can't do. And quite frankly, this one would be pretty tough to do in the town of Farragut, assuming all, you know, this one, all the adjacent properties would have to have a commercial zoning or an office zoning to even be able to get the parking lots that close
Yeah,
to
that's true.
periphery sidelines or property lines. But
The only reason I put this on the screen is it does show that transition concept. The yellow buildings are the 2-story. They're kind of around the periphery. Again, I'm not promoting necessarily this. I'm just showing you this concept. And as you go inside, interior, you got the 3- and 4-story buildings. Of course, like you said, Noah, the parking lot. Right now, the buffer strip drives everything.
Right.
So you can't put a parking lot in a buffer strip, and in my opinion, you shouldn't ever put a parking lot in a buffer strip. But so, you know, the buffer strip and the setback, like I mentioned earlier, are really inseparable. And we need to get some kind of direction on those in order to drive what could be done, you know, with other aspects of this kind of development. But that gives you a visual of kind of what this transition concept would look like.
One thing I might add here, just looking at these buildings, the darker orange these larger buildings are actually 3/4 splits, and that's kind of the worst case scenario that we were looking at as we were looking at building height. And you'll notice the lighter color orange is the 3-story side, the darker is the 4-story side. You'll notice most of our parking, I think you'll find this, Mark and I had this discussion, most developers, 3/4 splits are pretty popular buildings. And we did put elevators in this building, but it's not uncommon for these buildings to not have elevators from the standpoint that all the parking is on the 3-story side, so you don't have anyone going up more than 2 flights of stairs. The 4-story side, they would basically be going down to a basement unit. This is a pretty popular type of design. The 1 4-story side on the what would be on my far right, that actually is a budding commercial up front. So we are actually acting as a buffer between the commercial that runs along a major thoroughfare there and which is actually a school behind us and some residential to the left. So that worked out really well, and it's been a very popular development. It was a very heated neighborhood meeting when we first started with that project. And they actually preferred having some buildings like those carriage buildings, which are 2-story buildings, as you had said, Mark, 6 garages on the bottom and 2 units up top. And they preferred that better because we actually slid some of these buildings down some because they like the fact that when you come to the end of an intersection, that you have a building there to block headlights and stuff. And so this doesn't show the final drawing, but we actually shifted some of those buildings to deflect headlights and that sort of thing. And you know, we looked at some screening and buffering and that kind of thing, but there's nothing that's a better buffer than a solid structure. And so just kind of talking you through our thought process, it's a lot easier to see what something looks like, and that's just an example.
Well, getting back to the questions, I guess I'm trying to keep it focused again. I mean, how do y'all feel about the changing the setback 50 to something else?
One of my concerns is that we do it with this in mind, but then somebody else with a smaller development is going to request that sort of thing too, or one residential to the other. There's just all sorts of can of worms that I see opening up, because that's been something that the town has, you know, been consistent with over the years.
Excuse me a second, Mark.
Yeah.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but currently, if you have residential against commercial, what's the setback? It's
Well,
35 feet.
35-foot
That's the buffer.
buffer. Yeah, it's a 35-foot buffer
Is building setback
for general commercial. If it's
Just-
regional commercial, it's a 50.
buffer?
Yes.
What's the setback?
Well, you can't put anything in.
I understand that, but what's the setback?
It's greater than that. It depends on how the parking lot is arranged.
Okay,
But essentially, you obviously can't get any closer than whatever the buffer is.
okay. Thank you. Just for my own clarification, I just want to know that. Thank you.
Again, you can try to, if you can change the setback, but if you don't address the buffer, then you haven't changed the setback, because basically the buffer right now, you know, drives, buffer and setback are really interrelated on these kind of projects.
I think for clarification for folks at home, they're both measured from the perimeter property line. And so you're not necessarily getting a double whammy on both of these items. So you're not having to add the buffer and the setback together.
That's right.
I'm just trying to clarify. Maybe some people we keep talking about some of these things. We try not to use them interchangeably because they are two distinct things, but they're both measured from always from the perimeter property line.
Yeah, there's no setback from the buffer. I mean, you could theoretically build
up next to the
up
buffer.
to the edge of the buffer, assuming you didn't disturb any vegetation in the buffer, and to do that. But yeah, it's a good point.
Mark, I'll give you my answer to your question. I think this is something we need to give serious consideration to. You know, the demand for housing and the types of housing that people are looking for is changing very quickly at a pace that I don't think we fully understand yet. And I could support this. You know, we lack this type of housing in our community, And quite frankly, I think I could see the day where some of our long-term developments are gonna have a hard time selling some homes because people are gonna say, guess what, that's just not what I want anymore. People don't want as big a houses, people don't want great big yards. That's just reality. I mean, it's changing pretty quickly.
So are
And
you talking about?
I'm talking about just item one. I
You're
mean,
okay with lessening it?
I'm
to-
okay with that, with the proposal they have, that as it gets taller, we add,
To 35 for the
right.
setback, and then
yes,
increased setback for taller buildings.
correct.
And I might add, on that, you're actually, if you go up to the maximum building height, you're actually back at the 50-foot
Mhm.
where it's at today. So you're not necessarily giving up, if you have a tall building, you're gonna be back to where you were at before with the 50-foot setback, so.
All right, I have a question just for clarity. If you change it to 35-foot setback, and you're next to agriculture or residential, you're still gonna have if we decide to keep the 50-foot buffer.
Then your
The
setback
buffer
is at least 50 feet.
Right.
Yeah.
It defaults to whatever the maximum is.
Yeah,
Okay.
the buffer would override the setback. Yep. Yeah, you almost need to deal with the buffer first, really. Probably should have put that one first, and we can always go to that, if y'all want to discuss the buffer strip, first. As you all know, the buffer strips in the town are kind of a sacred cow. They're highly valued, and I think they're highly useful.
Hey, Mark, just
The-
as clarification,
Uh-huh.
and I may have misunderstood what you said. Did you say that if it abuts residential, it's a 50-foot setback buffer?
The buffer is, which would essentially make
commercial.
your,
For commercial,
Not
correct?
for commercial.
Now, we're talking about if you butt residential and
Right.
agricultural, the idea behind agricultural is the first typical step for a rezoning would be from agricultural to residential. So you're trying to protect residential property.
Yeah.
But what they're also saying, what we're saying, is that like Mark said, is really the buffer is probably what we should talk about first, because if the buffer is greater than the setback, the buffer overrules the setback.
I understand.
Even though they're both measured from that same line that we talked about. And so maybe, I mean, this is as good a time as any to maybe, let's just jump into.
Yeah, we can talk the buffer.
There's some things that
Yep.
that we historically really haven't allowed inside the buffer, and there's ways to revegetate buffers, and so I think one of the things that these guys maybe have talked about.
well, the buffer probably needs to be approached from the way it's currently structured, and that is buffer strips vary depending on what the property is adjacent to.
Mm-hmm.
So first of all, you got where you have a situation, someone wants to develop multifamily and the adjacent property is zoned in residential or agriculture, then you currently have a 50-foot setback. So
50
under, I'm
Buffer
sorry.
or setback?
Buffer.
I mean buffer. You have a 50-foot buffer strip.
Making sure.
Yeah, I'm jumping back to the first here, sorry. So, under that, that particular aspect of buffer strips, let's look at those questions, because they're going to be, I think, different than where you have an R6 property abutting commercial or office, or even on the front buffer potentially. So these first questions, are dealing with where it abuts residential agriculture. And the first one is, are you comfortable reducing the buffer strip width where you have that kind of scenario? Currently, like I said, it's 50 feet. The applicants are actually wanting to go to as low as 25 feet. And one of the applicants is requesting to be able to grade within a buffer. As I've told the applicants from day one, I would never support grading in a buffer that is wooded. I think that would be very counter to the town's history and numerous policies that the town has. If you have an open field, then I think you have potentially a different opportunity there. So.
Because, Mark, wouldn't that just be, they go in and grade, and then they have to go back in and replant?
You can actually grade in a buffer now if it doesn't have any, if it's
Mature
doesn't have any
vegetation.
tree cover.
Right.
As long as the finished slope is no steeper than 4 to 1. So, and then the staff also allows an applicant, even in a wooded buffer, to go in and selectively by hand thin out invasive exotic plant material, because sometimes if you don't do that, it's going to grow up, and just like it did with your house, Rita, the vines and things will eventually kill the trees, and so you don't have any buffer anyway. So under those two scenarios, you can do some things in the buffer strip. But just grading in a buffer where you have, tree cover, the staff would not support that.
So but they would have to go back and replant in that area.
Yeah, even in the one where, yes. Yeah, and they'd have to plant it currently to what's required for a 50-foot buffer.
Okay, so
Yeah.
so you would be losing great big trees in coverage down to smaller,
Well, if you allowed them to grade in.
if you're allowed to grade,
Yes.
right? Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
The Derby Run apartments are over there off Kingston Pike,
Yes.
and the residential backs up to that. Was
Yes.
that built in the buffer zones were what they are now, or do you know?
They had a buffer strip requirement, and I don't remember exactly what happened with that development, how it was built. I think it actually predated my
Lanesboro.
employment. It's real old.
It came first in
So-
Lanesboro, and they're both R6.
It backs up to Sugarwood.
Yeah, but it's
yeah.
been built since we were in town.
Yeah,
Oh,
it has
yeah.
been built
They're
since
born
we're,
built.
yeah, but I think it predates me, so I'm not exactly sure
Back in the 90s.
what all
In
happened.
that case, we need to ask,
They do have a
here.
buffer strip though around
There's
around Derby Run, yeah, and Lanesboro. The
Okay.
other apartment on Fretz Road has a buffer strip around it.
We had proposed the 25-foot, and the way we arrived at that was because today office being 35, we felt like residential was a less intense use than office, and with a 2-story residential building, we felt like that the buffer shouldn't be greater in residential than it should be in commercial. But as you get back to taller buildings, to the suggestion I made earlier, we would be willing to increase that buffer if we were to go with taller buildings.
Is that something we could write in where the buffer strip, if it's 2-story building or a certain height, could be this, and then if it's a
Yeah.
little higher, it's
Yeah.
Same way we'd write it in as a setback. Have it, just a formula again.
Yeah. I guess what we need to get an answer to is, are you okay reducing the buffer strip width from 50 to something else? That's the first big question. Where it abuts residential agriculture.
well, in my opinion, even though it is residential, it's still a more dense
Yeah.
residential.
Has a lot of parking, has lighting,
Mhm.
it could have more noise.
More noise, more
you know.
people coming
So
and
yeah,
going.
it's important, and that's probably why we had the wide buffer in the first place. We were being, pretty cautious about when we crafted the R6 several years ago, because it was kind of a new thing. But it's something that needs to be discussed. as
But
to
I
whether-
think if it's a 2-story building, 2-story apartment, it's not so, and if that's on the edge of the buffer strip, all your parking and lighting is going to be in the front of that building. To me, a 2-story apartment, it's almost like a 2-story house. It's not as, you wouldn't want a 4-story apartment complex right there, but a 2-story.
But how many two-story buildings are you gonna have?
Well, and keep in mind, we can't really dictate where their parking is. And so that parking could be along the perimeter.
But it wouldn't be in the buffer strip?
No,
Right.
If
No.
it
it
was
definitely
a
wouldn't be in the
building
buffer
right up
strip.
to the buffer
Yes,
strip.
that's
And
right.
probably most of the
Buffer
noise would be
big.
generated from the parking lot,
Yep.
not
This
the other
property went
side.
like that, you could have the.
If there was noise and, that's.
But you couldn't dictate, they could conceivably bring the parking lot right up to the buffer strip.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes, they could. They
Okay.
could do that now.
Right.
Yeah, I understand.
And where this just shows 4
Right up against
buildings,
the line.
up against the line,
Yeah.
they could have put 15 or whatever.
Are you talking about maybe a less than 50-foot buffer in exchange for shorter building? But, I don't know. I'm just,
This picture actually shows I think it's either a 15 or 20-foot setback and no buffer strip. All the vegetation that's shown there is all to be planted.
So for quite a few years, you're going to be sitting there with short, not thick plantings.
Assuming there wasn't any mature vegetation.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, can I answer that a little bit? If you have mature vegetation, that's, like say you have a 40-foot tree, you're gonna have a clear zone underneath that tree of about 20 feet. If you have new plantings, they're starting out at 8 feet tall, you essentially have a screen from 0 to 8 feet. So if you have mature trees, and Mark knows that I'm not exactly the best tree hugger in the world, but I want to save the best trees as you can. I love good specimen trees. But if you're looking for creating a visual barrier, keeping the mature trees that are 30, 40, 50 foot tall, you're not creating that screen. Because the understory is what you're worried about. Everything underneath to create the visual screen. So when you're standing, I'm 6'2", and I'm looking through a tree that's 40 foot tall, I can see everything underneath it.
Well, it would depend on the trees.
We actually have, I mean, if that was the scenario, Mark, actually our ordinance would require some supplemental plantings in that area that has to do with X number of understory and some other things. So,
but also in your ordinance also says you give a credit, though, for that 40-foot tree that's got a 2-foot diameter.
Oh, yeah. Oh, you definitely get a credit.
So you don't have to plant as many trees in
Well,
there.
it would depend
That's
on...
overall the tree planting
It
plan.
depend on what you have. I mean, a lot of these fence lines in areas where you would have a natural buffer are red cedar, pretty much, and that's one of the best buffers you could ever have. It's
Well, I
real
understand.
dense.
I'm just playing devil's advocate here a little bit. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
but-
no, I understand, yeah.
I think I kind of look at it as two different points. One's preserving mature vegetation, which does, you naturally get a buffer, a nice buffer with that. Sometimes it's seasonal depending on what it is. I don't have a problem doing certain screening requirements, whether it be, solid fences, maybe a berm, different species of evergreens that can be planted on a certain spacing that would allow for a more intense screening. If we're looking at lighting, pollutants and that sort of thing, we typically do a photometric plan on most of our projects. That's something that, I don't know what your requirements are for photometric plans and spillover of lighting and that kind of things. Those are typical things that we get complaints from neighbors on. So, that may be another avenue you look at. So, I mean, if we're just looking at it as preserving the vegetation, I think that's an important thing. And there may be something on top of that you look at screening as a separate issue, that certain screening measures have to take place, and maybe it's a combination of fencing and landscaping, or berms and landscaping. So,
Well, one of my major concerns is the fact that we're not looking at specific sites. We need to look at the whole town.
Right.
Because, and you may do a Class A development, but somebody else may come in and that's not what they're gonna do.
And that was what we were looking at in trying to give these suggestions, not only Ross with his group, but my group that I'm representing, I'm Mark Bilek, 1313 Camille Road, Knoxville, Tennessee, is to give a generic, to get a program here that, like Noah was saying, that an engineer or an architect can sit down and create a starting point to do a development in your town.
I'm just going to throw out some things that I support and I don't support. I can't support any change to our buffer ordinance. I just can't. To me, that is something that is sacred to me personally. And so, however, I would support the density change, the height change. I would also support maybe the stair-step setback, starting at 35 and stair-stepping up to 50, depending on the height. And I do think, kind of echoing what Ron Honkin said, there are some changes, and I think it's time for us to look at this. Obviously, we have 2 applicants that are interested in coming to our town and building apartments. And I think there's a definite need for it. Obviously, we would like those apartments to to fit in well with the adjacent property owners, as well as something to be proud of here in the community. And so I think that times are changing a little bit with, mostly with density and height. Again, I would like to bring back up the architecture that I brought up the last couple of times. I think it's a great opportunity that if we created a new ordinance, that we could put some things in there that we don't already have that has to do with maybe materials. But I do think, I think it's exciting that we have folks that are interested in our town and looking at this. And again, pretty much everything that, you know, these guys, generally speaking, have brought up, maybe with the exception of the buffers. I think the buffers are just important to me, and I don't necessarily represent, you know, anybody except myself on this commission, but there is definitely some good things that could happen here, and there is some quid pro quo that can happen here that we could do to some of the low impact development practices that we talked about last time. The pervious pavers, I'm personally a fan of. I think it's a great product and reduces your detention requirements and stormwater, and some of the rain gardens and things that help water quality issues. But at any rate, with that being said, I'm just going to try to pass it on down the line and see if there's any kind of consensus that we're getting. We've kind of discussed this not only for these guys, but we kind of started discussing this maybe 6 months ago or a year ago, talking about that we kind of felt like this was coming down the pipeline, and eventually we're going to ask somebody's going to come to us with little higher density requirements or higher density allocations than what we currently have today.
No, and keeping with your question about the buffer strips, how do you feel? I understand you want to keep those. How do you feel about reducing the size of them but still keeping the buffers? So take them down from 50 to maybe 25 or 35.
I think there's a real reason why we incorporated 50, and I know it's hard for you to say that, or I guess I'll put it this way. I'm gonna put it back on me. It's hard for me to defend that office is less intensive than commercial, or commercial is less intensive than multifamily residential. I mean, personally, in my backyard, I would probably rather have an office than an apartment complex. I'm just going to throw that out there. They're 9 to 5, not on the weekends, and so forth. So it's different. They are both different. I think that the 50-foot setback is a lot to ask, and there's no doubt about it. It is actually more than what we ask for commercial. Commercial's 35 and office is 25. We're asking for 50 here, and but with some of my limited experience with multifamily and apartments, there's just more things that go on at 2 a.m. at apartment complexes that I don't, unless you're next to a 24-hour restaurant drive-through, I think there's just more things that go on in an apartment complex than they do in typical commercial and typical office.
Would you be in favor of reducing it if there were additional screening measures in place to limit visibility and light spillover and that kind of thing?
Well, we already basically we have a great ordinance that generically we call it a dark sky ordinance, but we really have a great ordinance already in place that addresses the light, and so I'm not necessarily concerned about that. We probably have one of the best, or if you want to call it the toughest, light ordinances in East Tennessee that really prohibits any kind of spillover onto adjacent properties or adjacent right-of-ways. But noise, I'm just not sure there's a way to mitigate noise. I mean, personally, I think of having a wood stockade fence would be a bad idea. I think the maintenance of it would get neglected. I think they're ugly. Ideally for me, I'd like to, just a natural buffer. The more natural it is, with all the weeds and all the shrubs and all the stuff growing in there, the better. I'd rather it not look like a golf course and be all manicured, and so so that's why if there was a mature buffer that was there, I think that mature buffer should be left alone. I think it's by far does a lot better job than a buffer that we could plant, and I've done them both. I've dealt with mature buffers and going in and supplementing buffers and then creating brand new buffers. And I know it's a lot of property for a developer to allocate when you're dealing with 50 feet times all the property that you abut, residential and agricultural. And so I know it is somewhat painful for a developer to have to allocate that property and just set it aside knowing you can't touch it. But that is something that this town, the principles of this town going back to 1980, I mean, it's always been a big deal. I mean, that was something that Knox County didn't do, that our founding fathers and mothers of the town of Farragut said, hey, this is something that we want. And I would have a really hard time in compromising that buffer. I know it's not what you wanted to hear, and believe me, there'd be times when having smaller buffers and zoning districts would probably put money in my pocket. But at the end of the day, I live here, and I try to represent the folks of Farragut the best that I can to try to determine what's best for the community at large, as well as what the principles that we were founded upon.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would say about that is not every buffer is created the same, and some buffers obviously work better than others. My point being, if it was reduced, it would give a developer more of an opportunity to create something that may be more widely acceptable under a variety of situations. And I agree, a wooden fence may not be the solution. We certainly wouldn't do that on our property, but putting in a berm that's 6 foot tall with some evergreens on top of it, you do get more buffering. And I'm sure your photometric plans and some of your regulations there highly regulate lighting coming from light fixtures and stuff on the site. The problem that's hard to regulate is headlights shining into bedroom windows and stuff. And that's one of those things that 50-foot buffer is great if it's full of vegetation. If it's very sparse vegetation, it may or may not accomplish what we're really trying to accomplish here. And so I think that's one of the things that maybe we could talk a little bit about is if it's not a sparsely vegetated area, even though it's 50 feet and there may be some large 40-foot trees in there, it's not going to give you adequate screening to really do what you may want it to do. And if you allowed us to maybe come back and have maybe a 10-foot strip or a 15-foot strip where we could come in and put a berm, put some other screening type material so it could be more consistent throughout the community, that would be the only thing I would ask you to consider.
I'm going to give you some feedback. I think, first of all, I want to tell you, I think both of you have done a great job of you're not trying to ram anything down our throat, which we've had that before, by the way, and I appreciate your patience. I'm just about where Noah is, but I'm going to give you, from my chair only, just that little window. I think there's an opportunity for you to educate us on what you've done and what can be done within these buffer zones, because I hear what you're saying, and I would agree. I still share his hesitation and reservation to do anything there, but I'm willing to listen. I would say that I would probably only be willing to bend on 2-story buildings. I think if it was 3 or 4, I'd be right back to where we are today.
Yes.
And it was kind of a comment that Louise made about, houses are 2-story, and we deal with that. Mark, just to go to a couple other questions that you had that I'll just provide some commentary on. I'm under item 2, question C, and D. Would grading in a buffer strip that is wooded be acceptable? I think sometimes just because a buffer strip is full of vegetation, I've seen some that are just a complete disaster. And I think that question, I would personally be comfortable with staff making that decision. Having the proper people, the proper professionals go out there and take a look at it. I would have great reservation to do it for all the reasons Noah mentioned, but I think there is a time that common sense has to prevail and say, this needs to be cleaned up a little bit, and there might be an opportunity to make it better. In regards to your hand removal of invasive exotic plant material, I have no problem with that, and that's becoming a bigger issue all the time. I just want to offer one other comment just from an educational standpoint in regards to how housing is changing. I think it was last week in the Wall Street Journal, they were talking about everybody wants smaller homes, these new generations. I don't know if you saw it, where General Electric went to their engineers and said, listen, build the next kitchen. And the new kitchen is basically 12 feet long, has everything in it, 2 ovens, and they sell this thing as a modular unit that is a plug and play for $15,000 now. I don't know if you saw that article, but it was interesting to read the article because it was more than just about the appliances. It was about what people's expectations are for quality and quantity to a certain extent, but also the fact they don't want these massive kitchens anymore.
Right. Yeah, we're seeing that a lot. There was just an article done in the National Business Journal about micro units pertaining to multifamily. And they're very popular in a lot of the major cities now, quite frankly, because people just don't spend a lot of time in their unit. And it really affects one bedrooms a lot more than it does your 2 and 3 bedrooms, because, you know, in 2 or 3 bedroom unit, you usually are maybe living with someone else and you kind of want to have your little bit more space. But on these 1 bedroom units, a lot of it depends on where it's at. You know, if it's a suburban deal, people usually like a little more square footage. We use the same property management company that manages one of the properties in north of Farragut, and they have very, very large units, and there's a lot of people that like those larger units out there. But as you get more around retail, you get people that everybody's different, and I think it just kind of gives you that option that people are looking for. Some people don't want the 4,000 square foot home. They like a smaller place that has the amenities that is just closer and more convenient. So it's just, you're just providing a variety of housing for different people's taste, let's say.
How does everybody else feel about the buffer? I know Noah and Ron.
Okay. I
Betty?
think it needs to stay at 50 feet. I think it needs to stay at 50 feet. And I agree with taking out the exotic plants. Do not agree with the going in and cleaning it up or grading in it. So basically what we have now, I guess, is what I support. The rest of it, I do think there should be architectural standards, and the setbacks with residential and agricultural property, or the buffers and the buildings. I think they should be the lower height buildings adjacent to those with the larger buildings, taller buildings inside the project. Let's see. I got a whole bunch of comments here. Certainly don't agree with removing any buffer. Basically agree with Noah.
Okay. Anybody else?
Yeah, I'm not particularly interested in reducing buffers at all. I'm really kind of concerned as we go into, well, like the issue of the compact stove and what, or GE thing you had, and people, is pertinent to the very high density metro areas and that sort of thing. I mean, that's driven by simply by cost. Not because people really want that. That's all they can afford. But you're not going to have the high density areas tend to stay pretty much where they've been for a long time. And even in the city of Knoxville, isn't much, can't be really considered high density compared to the major metro areas. And I don't think towns like us in this part and this county ought to be, getting real interested in developing high density residential areas. I can see people, I know a lot of people that have larger houses that would like to reduce the size of the houses. Usually not so much the size of the square footage as of the living of the residents, so much as the property that they're having to do maintenance on and that sort of thing. You got to pay, I think, need to pay a lot of attention to the architectural standards that we've been talking about, to see what can be done that's more compatible with the kind of people that we probably having living in this area for the next 50 years. That's probably not very helpful, but I think it's
Anybody else on the buffer?
and the other thing I want to mention that always strikes me when you're talking about these things, there isn't any level land in Farragut.
There's not much level land in many places.
And that makes a very big difference in how it does.
Right, and that's why the grading in the buffer is of concern to someone who's developing, because, like you just said, there is no, I've been doing commercial site design since 1991, and the last easy site I had was in '94. I have yet, and I'm sure you have the same, I'm preaching to the choir with this gentleman right here. There is not a site left in the United States that's easy anymore. Every site has some kind of an issue, whether it be slope, stormwater, where you're going to take it, sanitary. I just had a project that I did for Pilot. They have a travel center in Bloomsbury, New Jersey, that's on a septic system, because the nearest sanitary sewer system to that center is 75 miles away. This is Bloomsbury, New Jersey. This is in one of the most high-dense areas of the United States, and they don't have public sewer within 75 miles. So like I said, all the easy sites are gone.
Right, that's why public sewer systems are, have been required for a long time.
Well, I understand, but I mean, New Jersey is one of the oldest states in the United States.
I get to do it all over.
Yeah.
Okay, anybody else with the buffer? Got to keep this moving.
I will say that some people that I've talked to, their opinion was that if you're going to have a multi-family development behind them, they want more buffer space instead of less. Like I said before, people are always, because they know I'm on the planning commission, people are always stopping me and telling me things. And when I mentioned to a couple of those people lately, we're doing this, you need to pay attention because I don't want to hear you coming at me in 3 or 4 months. But that was the thing. If there's going to be an apartment complex behind them, they want more buffer space, certainly not less.
Like how much?
If I could make one
Well,
point.
they didn't give me a specific number,
Well,
but
probably if they did, they'd tell you about a mile.
probably so.
Right.
Probably
Somewhere
so.
no closer to that, right? One issue to keep in mind with the buffer space, what I'm just thinking to myself, how do we address this? The way developers are going to address a larger buffer is taller buildings. You're going to see less developments with 2-story buildings because they're just not going to have the amount of property to be able to do 2-story buildings. They're going to go to 3- and 4-story buildings. So that's kind of what you have to kind of weigh there. If you go with a larger buffer, you're going to get taller buildings. If you go with a little bit smaller buffer and incentivize people to go to shorter buildings, then you're going to get. It really depends on what's more important. Is it more important to have a larger buffer and be okay with taller buildings, or is it better to have less buffer and shorter buildings? We did 2-story because all the buildings, all the residential that surrounds us were 2-story structures. And it seemed to be in keeping with the area that a lot of those residential units were 2 stories. So we tried to keep with what was already out there. So just keep that in mind as you're talking about buffers and kind of the give and take with that.
Well, I'll also say that a lot of the people I talked to don't want to see multifamily. They moved here for a suburban lifestyle, and that's what they don't want an interference with that. It's the same old. I'm here, and I don't want anybody else.
Sure. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But that's that's what people who have come here and previously see Farragut as a suburban community. I have my yard, I have my house, and that's why I'm here. If I wanted to live in downtown Knoxville or New York City, I'd do that.
Yeah, we're talking about 12 units the acre. The Marble Alley deal that we're doing in downtown Knoxville right now, I think we're at 35 or 40 units the acre. So there's a big difference in comparing apples to apples with some of that density stuff. Technically anything that's more than 1 unit is multifamily. And I think where people have the biggest heartburn is the rental aspect of it. And there's nothing that keeps someone from renting out a duplex or a townhouse development and to to your point earlier, there's a demand out there for rental property because people are very transient today. Some people don't see the value that was in their home long term after the recession. And so we're seeing a lot more people that are renting today. And one of the things I would caution you guys about that, and don't be willing to step outside the box and think about this for a second. If you allow developers to come in that have experience with rental properties, they have experience with a proper maintenance team and staff. They understand how to qualify residents. They understand how to maintain their properties, and they're much better maintained than a absentee landlord that goes in and buys a block of townhouses and goes in and rents them out, and that's allowable. Even single family would be allowable, I would assume. Mark, you can correct me if I'm wrong. Is there anything that would keep someone from going in and purchasing as an investor townhouses in a development and renting those out? That's the only thing. You just got to be aware of what the demand is, and there's a demand for rental housing, and it's how do you service that demand in a way that is best for the community. So I understand. I hear it all the time. I don't want rental. What kind of people are going to be living next to me and all this? And what we have to understand is we do a background check on everyone that lives in our community.
And again, I say that's you, and you do
Certainly.
a good job, but somebody else may come in that we don't have that options with.
Here's the way you put that option on most people. You do what Noah was talking about. You make sure that you're architecturally you're using the right materials. You're not allowing inexpensive materials, and you encourage a nice development. And you can do that with a lot of the architectural review. And most properties today, I have a lot of people come to us and say, we're trying to cut costs back. What can we do to build? We may not want to do a Class A development. We may want to do a Class B development. I said, guys, the difference in a Class A and a Class B is really not that much because you still have to buy lumber, you still have to buy drywall. Your biggest difference is your finishes. And that basically puts people in a category that, we have to maintain this property well because it's such an expensive asset, and the banks are going to hold them at such a high standard that most developers, and if you ride around other parts of Knoxville and you see some of the new properties that are coming on, their standards are very similar. They're all managed by certain property management companies. I think you guys are doing a very wise thing by limiting the size of property that can be developed. So you're keeping folks that are not seasoned property managers out, and you're encouraging people that are more experienced to come in and manage these larger properties. So,
I'm certainly not an expert on rental properties and apartments, but over the last several years, I've had a lot of well-compensated people that have joined my team, and many of them have wanted to rent. Based on what I've heard from them, the high-end rentals have a very long waiting list of people trying to get in there.
yes.
Where the lower end, you can get in tomorrow. They're running 70-80% occupancy. The high-end ones, you might have to wait a year to even finally make it into the batting order.
Yep.
And just I can tell you, just as of this time frame, I've moved 2 people to Farragut, opening up a company here in Farragut, and I have 2 individuals that were not able to find rental housing of the caliber they wanted. These are well-compensated individuals in the town of Farragut. So they're living outside of the town of Farragut. So I work hard to get a business going here, and now that I've got 2 people that can't find a place to rent at the level of quality
Right.
that they want. So I can just give you a real-life experience.
I'm going to throw an idea out that, in a way, it backpedals a little bit from what I said. And I'm thinking back to when I was in college in an apartment, and to me, it's more the noise because, like I said, we can deal with the light pollution through our lighting ordinance. But when I think about the noise that always occurred, it wasn't from the apartment itself. It was from the parking lot. It was, coming home later than we probably should have, and hooping and hollering in the parking lot and yelling from one guy to the other. And I guess where I'm going with this is I might warm up to the idea of having the increased setback and increased buffer on a parking lot, but maybe allow the building a little bit closer. Because when I think of a building between a property line, if it was all landscaped all the way to the building, and it's very contrary to this diagram that we're looking at here. I'm thinking of more having the parking interior to a apartment complex versus the parking being along the perimeter. And and I was just kind of curious if anybody else has any experiences with that. But when I think of the noise, it's always generated in the parking lot, or it's a trash truck going to the dumpster at 6 a.m. that is in the parking lot, or it's one of these kids that has the coffee can mufflers on their car that make so much noise driving through the parking lot, and it's not from from somebody's balcony or somebody's window on their apartment. It's that transition from the parking lot to the building. I just kind of want to throw that out.
That's kind of how Lanesboro's laid out, isn't it? I've only been in there a couple times, but that isn't.
Well, it's a mixture.
Is it?
It seems like it's a mixture. It has some parking that's more internal, and then maybe up closer to the interstate, they have parking that kind of runs along the interstate right away. Which for there, you got the interstate next to you.
I like your idea, though. I think.
But I'm just trying to generate some discussion, and thinking that we do penalize apartment developers above and beyond even a commercial developer, an extra 15 feet, and so I really couldn't ever think about ever going below that 35-foot threshold, and definitely again the parking to me I would always that 50 feet. I'm just kind of throwing some ideas as we're discussing this and thinking through this, that maybe there is something that would dangle a carrot in front of a developer to be a little more innovative in their site design, to think about having to more contain their noise issues to more the internal side of the site. It forces you to think a little bit harder about it. Doesn't really affect your density, but it does give you a little bit more room to grade and start thinking about those slopes. One of the things that I'll kind of point out is it is possible to take a tough site and do some innovative things, and we did it at Renaissance, albeit we have a lot of retaining walls. I have one retaining wall that's 900 feet long, and they're not cheap, but it is possible to preserve the buffers, and that's why those retaining walls are there. It's not because I couldn't get the terraces in; it's because I had to preserve a buffer, and I couldn't get up into that buffer to do the grading to lay the slope back to make the whole site a little bit easier to grade. So it can be done. And it costs a little bit more, but at the end of the day, if the ends justify the means, i.e. the market is out there willing to pay X dollars in rent, then usually the project, you can make the thing work. Again, if the market's not there, then it's not there. But you can do some things with some creativity in the site, and that's kind of what I kind of lean towards the whole OSR overlay with this, to allow an R6, i.e. apartment developer, to say, okay, we're going to give you a little more height, we're going to give you a little more density, we're going to do some things that you otherwise you couldn't do, but we're going to ask for some things in return. And maybe we leave the old R6 alone and go straight to have an overlay, or maybe we incorporate the whole thing in the R6 and make all future apartment developers fall under this. But and maybe that's, obviously it's getting late and we're thinking about these things, but does anybody have any ideas about the parking lot? I mean,
I agree with what you're saying. I agree with what Commissioner Honkren said earlier about the two-story building. Putting that up against, I could see a 35 feet buffer building right there, parking lot on the interior. I can, there's flex. I think there's something to be said for that. You avoid that parking lot noise, which I agree. And if you're talking about higher end apartments, you tend not to have the
Yahoo 22 years ago,
yes.
and hollering at 2 a.m.
Yes.
Yes.
But also, isn't it part of our land use plan that we're trying to encourage more?
Yeah, looking at alternate housing choice is one of the key points that was mentioned as part of the land use plan.
But I wouldn't want to go below 35 feet. I think that seems to be, yeah.
Does anybody else have any thoughts on just
You're kind of maybe
about where the
about
noise is generated in apartments?
a lower building with a potentially 35-foot buffer and then a 50-foot buffer or setback for a parking lot.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then maybe as you go interior to the development, the height can go up.
I know that's probably challenging to try to. It almost kind of goes back to a PUD and trying to come up with some narrative that's based upon certain philosophies, which goes against having it all objective and laid out empirically.
Well, that's
But-
where I'd like to see more discussion, because, one of the I'd say core values of the town for forever has been the 50-foot buffer. But then, you look at, some of the challenges are presented. I think we have more ways to tailor, for a win-win situation if we could maybe explore the discussion of the overlay and how that might work into it, and then decide whether we want to make any changes or not. I don't think we've discussed that option enough.
I agree.
As far as the noise in an apartment complex, it depends on the people who are living there.
Depends on
I've lived
how big it is.
an apartment complex where.
But you're talking a
there was
large number of people, more so than what you have in a residential community.
Yeah.
And more people create more noise. If somebody living in a house behind me has 6 kids, then that's gonna be more noise than somebody that has 1 kid. So it's just the fact that it's more people. More people create more noise, be it cars, be it voice, being slamming of doors, whatever, coming and going. And I think that's the issue that several people have.
But you're never going to get away from the 1 mile.
No.
It's just
No.
inherent.
That's what my crisis.
How many
report was.
people don't want to change the 50 no matter what? Open space, overlay, whatever. I mean, it's fine. I'm just trying to get
That's me.
a little more direction.
I'm still on the
Well,
proverbial fence.
I'm still there, but I'd like to hear more discussion about this overlay concept.
No, I'm.
Discussion.
I think the overlay works best for both of us. I think we don't know what the ordinance is going to look like when we get finished here, but I think we're both thinking that we like the flexibility of some type of HUD option to build this design specific. I mean, we're in a scenario where we've got a drive aisle on our project that you come into a garage. Well, those people are going to be coming into a garage, shutting the door, getting out, and going inside, and so that's obviously a unique situation. It's not like a typical parking lot scenario. So.
But again, I bring
gives that
back the
flexibility.
fact that not everybody is.
That's right. It just gives you that flexibility, and it's site specific. And I don't want to muddy the waters too much, because I think you've got to think big picture for the town of Farragut, but have the flexibility of being able to have a system in place that if somebody comes in and they can't meet these requirements, well, here's why we can't, here's what we're doing, and here's what we're willing to give back because we can't meet those things. And that's a great option,
You're talking about a PUD.
Yes.
Let me tell you, as much as I like the philosophy of the PUD, the real issue is, when I was trying to make it easy for the developer
it's not.
and for the civil engineer to draw a little concept plan and say, hey, this project works or it doesn't work, you put a PUD on it, and you're spending a lot more money and a lot more time and you're having to come in and get the flavor of this commission.
One thing to think about.
Development, it'll be worth the investment to do that, because then you have flexibility, but in my mind, you also have control flexibility between this body and the developer and the town staff, and you can deal with topography and other things and
You're right.
get where
Gives
you
us-
want to go without being. So it's not just flexibility. It's, I think, to me, a more control flexibility.
It would give the planning commission a ton more control, because it pretty much kind of says, this is what we like, this is what we don't like,
But you're not
and we
gonna
can
come in
change
and
our
throw a-
mind from
you're not gonna come
project
in
to
and throw a
project.
stick building up.
But let me tell you what's dangerous about it is they will be long meetings. They'll and not that this, but I'm just letting you know, dealing with that type of creativity requires everybody coming together and hashing out a lot of details that staff is not really authorized to hash out. Staff can make some recommendations. Again, if you get a chance and you're not familiar with the PUD concept, read up on it. It is a kind of a design build concept. You kind of sit and create it as you draw it, and you brainstorm together. But it is a moving target for the developer, because they don't know what we're going to approve. What we approved last week for the other developer can be completely different, and it's written right there. We have the authority to say, well, I don't care what we did for them. We don't like that. We're not going to do it again.
Well, you can keep the 50 foot in your base.
Oh yeah, no, there's definitely
And then
some
you've got
basic
the-
things you can do.
That's kind of what I'm trying to
Dealing with the
establish, is
overlay.
what are the absolute
minimums. Right.
Then you'd have to, from there, you could have whatever, an overlay or a
You could
planned
even
unit
build some
development.
things into that requirement in the overlay.
I think if you have a good enough overlay or you
Another-
give it enough flexibility, you don't need a planned unit development. I have a little bit of concern about planned unit developments because they can get overused, and then you don't even know what everybody. You got all these different developments all over town that have completely different requirements, and it's very hard to track, and it's very hard to know what you're enforcing or
Well, I think-
what was, you know.
From a
required
staff
for-
perspective, I think a PUD would be very challenging.
Yeah.
Because you just can't, when
not
a developer
against
comes
it,
in to
but-
visit with Mark for guidance, Mark's like, well, you got to talk to the planning commission.
Yeah.
And so, and I would think that'd be real challenging. Maybe that's a good thing for you, but I would think really all that it makes, again, I like a PUD. I think there's a lot of great things about the philosophy behind it. It is challenging, and I think if we put some base, I think we did a good enough overlay.
Yeah, that's kind of what.
Then I don't necessarily think we need a PUD.
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm talking about. Is something like an OSR, except, you know, it has a lot of flexibility in there, but there are known requirements, and people aren't varying. Every project is not something completely different. Yeah, so how you put that together is, you know, challenging, and that's what I was trying to get. You know, I can't really proceed if I don't know what, you know, what you all are willing to try to work with the developer on. I guess in this case, it sounds like the buffer strip below 35 feet is an absolute no. It sounds to me like you might be willing to go to 35, maybe. In exchange.
I don't think I don't think that's unanimous either.
I don't.
Okay.
Yeah.
I don't think that's an absolute in that context. The only way I would come off of that is if it was another way to have this flexibility of certain applications. But you know, to me, you got to move me off that 50 foot.
Well, there's definitely
I'm
some
not
things
there.
that, that I want quid pro quo if we do something like that.
Mhm.
I mean, like what we talked about, maybe with the open space or the low impact development practices, architectural.
Architectural.
I mean,
yeah.
we're giving up a lot and saying, hey, just like we do in OSR, there are some things that we allow for lot frontages, lot sizes in the R1 OSR that dangles a carrot in front of a developer and say, hey, we know you got a little tougher site than what, you know, the big, nice flat fields that we used to have. And here are some things that you can do, but you're going to have to turn around and do some things maybe to a little bit higher standard. And I think these guys are willing to do that. And so, I think that's important to always keep in mind that we're gonna give a little, and then we're gonna ask for quite a bit. So
I'm gonna offer just a suggestion here, and I don't know if it's good or bad, but I'm gonna risk offering it. You know, I think from time to time we get things brought to us that, quite frankly, we could spend an entire evening talking about. But there's been a lot of conversation tonight, and I think what needs to happen now is people need to let it settle in their mind and mull it over a little bit. Mark, maybe something that we could do and not run afoul of any sunshine laws or anything. You know, you've presented a list of questions. Some we've discussed, some we haven't. Perhaps what you could do is send those to each member of this body. There's a lot to think about here after the discussion tonight. And people could give you their input. We certainly aren't going to come to an end result, but then you could share that with the group as a whole. And then when we come back together, we'll be a little better prepared and a little bit further down the road to have some discussion. I also think both of you brought some ideas that, you know, gives you a chance to go back and bring some more firm examples of ideas that you think we're not quite grasping, alternatives within the buffer zone and so forth. And then, you know, for the chairman, the comment I would make, I think this may be one of those topics that it might be worthwhile having a meeting just on this.
Just a workshop.
You know, it's Ed St. Clair and I were talking earlier in a joking way, and you were part of this at that time, when we used to have to meet twice a month for 6-7 hours at a crack. And I'm certainly not advocating that. But once in a while there is a topic that I think deserves a meeting of its own, and we focus just on that, and I think this is one of those. Much like we're doing with design standards and so forth, there reaches a point in meetings where there's just fatigue, and then everybody leaves and they wake up the next morning and they don't really recall everything that was said. And I think there just needs to be a settling of the minds and give people a chance to kind of mull this over and think about it, and let's come back and let's have a meeting to just focus on this item. That's my suggestion.
I would be happy with preparing an email to send to Mark, and he could share it with you guys with maybe some suggestions that we might have from other municipalities, and that would just kind of give you a developer's perspective, and then you guys can make your decision based on what you think is best for the community.
I think that, in considering this sort of thing, that what has to be considered, which we kind of omit in our today, is the fact that you almost need to have everything going on, have sort of site specific. You know, you can't.
Yeah.
That's where that PUD comes back in.
But that's why,
Right.
that's why I would like to hear more discussion in that area, and also have, because I'm going back to also some notes, Mark made too. He talked about, having, I think the one crack in his flexibility was talking about, how did you say it? Staff would also entertain lessening the buffer in the context of an open space, residential overlay, or PUD. Of course, it said if the area in question were not mature tree cover, but that first part of that statement, I'd like to understand more of your perspective on, obviously you were having some, I'll say thawing out of a position in that statement.
Well, I mean, if you got
In a certain consideration, of course.
development.
But I'd like to understand more about that, because I'm trying to think in terms of flexibility, but having control. And then as we tailor things to.
It kind of relates
areas
to
of
what
the
Noah
town.
was
And
saying.
in fact, there's not that many places it's gonna apply anyway.
Right.
Yeah, if you're gonna potentially
Very.
relax something, then here's what are they gonna provide on their end,
Right.
So it may be more open space, maybe,
Well, it might be we have to put some
architectural,
specifics in that,
yeah.
so that there is a way to.
Does anybody else have any comments or questions at this time?
Yeah, I do have to tell you my noise anecdote. When I was,
Do I need to adjourn the meeting first?
no, this will be quick. In my 8 years of college, it took me a while.
But you had a good time.
It was the same college for the whole 8 years, and I lived in different places during those 8 years, but all of them were within 200 feet of a busy railroad in North Carolina. Guess what? You sleep right through it after about a week. And I suspect a lot of apartment dwellers do the same.
Is that why it took 8 years, because you slept a lot? Is it?
Slept through that 7 a.m. class.
No, I had to repeat every grade.
Oh, I got.
You're saying we should ask for a railroad yard before we ask for the apartments?
I'm just saying, noise is oversold.
Do we have any utilities?
No, ma'am.
In that case, the June 19th, 2014 meeting is adjourned.
Oh,
Downtown Atlanta, we could make all the noise that we wanted to, and they just, it was.